taking earmarks or putting earmarks in the spending bills, then I think you'll be consistent. Let me ask you about this. Let me ask this. Term limits. You ran on term limits. I think we should have term limits for our elected leaders. You've been in Congress 18 years.
But I never ran on voluntary term limits. There's a big difference. I didn't sign a pledge for a voluntary term limit. Matter of fact, some of the best people that I worked with, who were the most principled, came in on voluntary term limits. Some of them broke their promises, and some didn't, and they were very good people. So some of the good people left. And it's true, I didn't run on that, Tim. You're wrong on that. I support term limits. You know, and I voted for all. We had 16 votes one time on term limits, and I voted yes for them. But voluntary term limits is a lot different than compulsory term limits. It's good to have a turnover, but that isn't the solution either. It's the philosophy of government that counts.
But if you believe in the philosophy of term limits, why wouldn't you voluntarily limit?
Well, it's one of those. It's one of those things that's not. I mean, you don't see that I'm campaigning on that. I mean, I don't think it's a solution. Philosophy is the solution. What the role of government ought to be. So if you have a turnover and the same people come in and they believe in big government, nothing good is going to come of it.
Let me ask you about immigration, because that's a big issue here, and there has been a profound change in your thinking on that. Back when you ran for president in 1988, Libertarian, you said, quote, as in our country's first 150 years, there shouldn't be any immigration policy at all. We should welcome everyone who wants to come here and work. You've changed your view.
During that campaign, I remember I got into trouble with the Libertarians because I said there may well be a time when immigration is like an invasion and we have to treat it differently. And I think in one sense, with the welfare state out of control, see, my approach to immigration is somewhat different than the others. Mine is you deal with it economically. We're in worse shape now because we subsidize immigration. We give food stamps, Social Security, free medical care, free education, and amnesty. So you subsidize it, you have a mess. Our hospitals are being closed. Conditions have changed. And I think that we should have, and 9/11 has occurred. Why shouldn't we be looking at people coming in? So there's, this means that we should look at immigration differently. It's an economic issue more than anything. If our economy was in good health, believe me, I don't think it'd be an immigration problem. We'd be looking for workers and we would be very generous.
You say you're a strict constructionist of the Constitution, and yet you want to amend the Constitution to say that children born here should not automatically be U.S. citizens.
Well, amending the Constitution is constitutional. What's a contradiction there?
So have the Constitution as written, you want to amend?
Well, that's constitutional to do it. Besides, it was the 14th Amendment. It wasn't the original Constitution. And there's a confusion on the interpretation. In the early years, it was never interpreted that way. And it's still confusing because individuals are supposed to have birthright citizenship if they're under the jurisdiction of the government. And somebody who illegally comes in this country as a drug dealer, is he under the jurisdiction and their children deserve citizenship? I think it's awfully confusing. And matter of fact, I have a bill to change that as well as a constitutional amendment to clarify it.
Let me ask you about drugs and go back again to your 1988 campaign and see where you stand today. All drugs should be decriminalized. Drugs should be distributed by any adult to other adults. There should be no controls or production, supply, or purchase for adults. Is that still your position?
Yeah, it's sort of like alcohol. Alcohol's a deadly drug, kills more people than anything else. And today, the absurdity on this war on drugs, Tim, has just been horrible. We now, the federal government takes over and overrules state laws where state laws permit medicinal marijuana for people dying of cancer. The federal government goes in and arrests these people, put them in prison with mandatory, sometimes life sentences. This war on drugs is totally out of control. If you want to regulate cigarettes and alcohol and drugs, it should be at the state level. That's been my position, and that's where I stand on it. But the federal government has no prerogatives on this. When they wanted to outlaw alcohol, they had enough respect for the Constitution to amend the Constitution. Today, we have all these laws and abuse, and they don't even care about the Constitution. I'm defending the Constitution on this issue. I think drugs are horrible. I teach my kids not to use them, my grandchildren, in my medical practice. Prescription drugs are greater danger than hard drugs.
But you would decriminalize?
I would, at the federal level. I don't have control of the states, and that's what the Constitution says.
Let me ask you about race, because I read a speech you gave in 2004, the 40th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, And you said this: contrary to the claims of the supporters of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the act did not improve race relations or enhance freedom. Instead, the forced integration dictated by the Civil Rights Act of '64 increased racial tensions while diminishing individual liberty. That act gave equal rights to African Americans to vote, to live, to go to lunch counters. And you seem to be criticizing it.
Well, we should do this at a federal level. It's a federal lunch counter be okay for the military. Just think of how the government, caused all the segregation in the military until after World War II. But when it comes, Tim, you're not compelled in your house to invade strangers that you don't like. So it's a property rights issue. And this idea that all private property is under the domain of the federal government, I think, is wrong. So I think even Barry Goldwater opposed that bill on the same property rights position, and that and now this thing is totally out of control. If you happen to like to smoke a cigar, the federal government's going to come down and say you're not allowed to do this.
But you would vote against, if you would vote against the Civil Rights Act if it was today.
If it were written the same way, where the federal government's taken over property, it has nothing to do with race relations. It just happens, Tim, that I get more support from black people today than any other Republican candidate, according to some statistics. And I have a great appeal to people who care about personal liberties and to those individuals who would like to get us out of war. So it has nothing to do with racism. It has to do with the Constitution and private property rights.
I was intrigued by your comments about Abe Lincoln. According to Paul, Abe Lincoln should never have gone to war. There were better ways of getting rid of slavery.
Absolutely. 600,000 Americans died in a senseless civil war. No, he shouldn't have gone to war. He did this just to enhance and get rid of the original intent of the Republic. I mean, it was an iron fist.
We still have slavery.
Oh, come on, Tim. Slavery was phased out in every other country of the world, and the way I'm advising that it should have been done is do like the British Empire did. You buy the slaves and release them. How much would that cost compared to killing 600,000 Americans, and where it lingered for 100 years? I mean, the hatred and all that existed. So every other major country in the world got rid of slavery without a civil war. I mean, that doesn't sound too radical to me. That sounds like a pretty reasonable approach.